Today, we are going to take a look at all the different types of watercolor paint options that there are and how they perform on their own and together. At the end of today's video, we're going to have some beautiful swatch cards that you can reference to your different colors, as well as a reference sheet that will have all the different ways that they perform and interact with. So let's just dive right into taking a look at the different forms that watercolor can come in. First up, we have watercolor, and the traditional form is in tubes. So tube paints come in a variety of sizes. There are little ones like this. So we have our, oops, let's just organize this. We have a different variety of sizing. And it all comes down to also the manufacturer. The typical size is actually to come with something that is a 15 ml size. And then you have ones that have like little test ones that you can test out the paints that are gonna be more around, say, like a 5 ml size. This one here is 10. And the core paint is, I want to say, 12. With paint that come in tubes, you have the option of using them fresh from the tube. So you just open them up and put them on a palette to use it. Or you can put the paint in something like one of these, which is a full pan or a half, whoopsies. Sorry, I didn't mean to drop that. A full pan or a half pan, and then they dry and then you can re-wet them and use them wherever you want. So on the go in something like this. You also have the option of buying half pans and full pans that are already pre-made into their containers from a multitude of brands. The ones that I have here are from the brand Szmal and Schminke. Next up is our liquid watercolor paint. There are a couple of brands out there that do this. I personally own the Ecoline brand. There's also one called PH Martin, and they have a couple of different variations throughout that company that makes them. The Ecoline are actually a dye-based watercolor paint. And they come in a couple of options. As you can see, there's the option to have a dropper or just the lid. Personally, I would recommend getting anything when you do liquid base like inks and things like that to come with the dropper lid, because if you don't have it, then you need to also purchase droppers to allow you to pick up your paint and put it in any kind of wells or watercolor palettes that you can use and mix with. When it comes to the watercolor in a form of a drawing tool, you have watercolor crayons, watercolor pencils, and watercolor markers. For watercolor markers, there are a couple brands out there that I like to use. One of them is the Tombow, Faber-Castell, and the Ecoline markers as well. When it comes to Ecoline, if you get one of their markers in this color, then it'll match the same color that is the liquid form. And some of the brands are brush pen style. And then like these two, like the Faber-Castell and the Tombow, you not only have a brush pen side, but you also have a like the bullet end type shape. When I'm working with my watercolors and mixed media, using the watercolor crayons and watercolor pencils are some of my most favorite ways to add an extra texture and just play around with the ways that they interact with the paint and the paper themselves. So we're going to examine and look at that a little closer now. First up, let's create some swatch cards of our paints. One of the reasons why I love swatch cards so much is the fact that it allows you to really see what your paint is capable of through that individual color. So what I do is I take my watercolor paint, I paint it up here, and then I mix it in with some water as I go down the page. I also, on the back, will write down the name, the color, and the pigment that's used to create this mix, because that way I can take a look at the different colors that I own and just see how they perform. And maybe if I wanted to say mix them with another one, I can take a look at the back and see, oh, what kind of information I have about it. So this one here, I'm just gonna, here we go. You can really see how the different types of pigments that are made to create this green interact with one another. Same with this bluey gray right here and the purple. This will allow you to get an idea as well as to whether or not your paint is considered to be a smooth or a granulating paint. So what do I mean when I say smooth or granulating? Granulating paints have a texture to them that provide a, well, for lack of a better way of saying it, a granulation to the pigments. They are more coarsely ground, so then you can see the texture when the paint dries, versus something that's more of a smoother pigment that's been ground much finer. For your reference, just so you're aware, that this is a 3 by 3.5 inch sized card. I've created them out of my favorite watercolor paper. I suggest you do the same when it comes to creating your own swatch cards and reference sheets. Use your favorite sketchbook or your favorite type of watercolor paper. Mine is the Stonehenge cold press watercolor paper. Yours might be a Fabriano or a Canson. Just use what you have and really just focus on exploring what these paints can do. The first one that I'm going to swatch out for you guys so you can just see how it performs is paint from a tube that's been freshly squeezed down. You'll see I have a little bit of it right here, and you're going to find that when it comes to using fresh watercolor paint from a tube, a little goes a lot. A little goes a lot. I think the saying is a little goes a long way. There we go. That's more accurate. So I have water set to the side of me just so I can quickly grab it, along with some paper towels to wipe my brush with. So I'm just gonna grab some paint, brush it down. Clean that off a little and grab some more water and just like move this around a bit. Not all brands and pigments are the same when it comes to their strength and capabilities and actions in water. Some might be extremely powerful and strong, so just a little bit goes a long way and will spread really far, where others are going to be a softer paint color. The pigments in them don't spread that far and they stay pretty much put on the page where you put them unless you move it around yourself. Other brands as well, like say Core for example, have a material in their making that allows the paint to move really far, where other brands are more of a softer approach and are made with different materials. By doing this, I'm allowing the paint to just get a little wet because I've put quite a bit of water on here, and moving it around a little gives you the option to see how the paint interacts and how it spreads and how far and how strong it is. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it to the side to allow it to dry. Next up, let's do some liquid watercolor paint. Because the liquid one is a little special, I'm going to do this a little differently on my swatch card. So I'm going to take the paint, which depending on your brand, you may want to shake a little beforehand. Some of the paint. I'm going to just freshly put it on here. And then I'm just going to brush it out so I can get an idea of what it looks like this. But also, because this is liquid watercolor paint, let's do something a little different. Let's get a white a wet area. It's pre-wet. And now let's just drop the liquid in there to see what happens. Okay, that was so cool. Did you catch how fast that moved and how it just expanded out? Okay, so I'm gonna let this dry as well. Next up, let's do a marker. So I'm gonna do the Faber-Castell. Just gonna clean my paintbrush off from earlier. Okay, so I'm gonna go with the brush end, and I just want to see what kind of shapes I can get with it. How hard I can push down, how much liquid comes out. Kind of just see what it does when you draw next to it and paint into it. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we get it wet.
I also want to note at this point that depending on the paper that you're using with your watercolor markers will affect how they perform on the paper themselves. Because some papers are far more absorbent and will dry faster, where others will let the pigments and the dye-based materials sit on top longer.
And because it's a watercolor marker, I'm going to just, on the wet area, take the bullet end and just see if I can draw on it. When it comes to your watercolor markers, if you have more than one brand, I highly recommend doing this to each color that you have and each different brand. As I've mentioned, I love having access to every single color that I own for my swatch cards to really just see what my watercolors are like. And because I just said that, you know what? Let's do an Ecoline one as well. Make sure I've pre-cut enough of these. I did, good. So I'm gonna do the light pink one because sometimes the lighter colors perform differently than the darker pigmented and dye-based colors. So I'm gonna do the same thing as I did on the other one. I'm just gonna see what kind of shapes and how much liquid comes out if I brush down. See how it performs when it's kind of layering on top of each other. Now let's just see how it spreads.
On day 5 of our 5-day watercolor challenge, I'm going to be ending the week off with experimenting with different types of watercolor paper, as well as just seeing how our paints perform on some mixed media paper.
And let's draw on that wet spot. Okay, I'm gonna set this aside so it can dry. For the next one, I wanna go over the watercolor crayons. What I love about the watercolor crayons, sorry, I said crayons, I meant watercolor pencils, is that you can use them as if they were just your regular colored pencils and draw with them, but you also have the option of going in and adding the water to give it more characteristics.
So the first thing I'm just going to draw right here is just a big section of the color so I can go back and re-wet it in a moment.
Do that, and then let's just like quickly draw something. Ooh. Not very.
Now that that house is done, let's go back and re-wet everything and see how it performs with water. As you can see, when I wet it, it spreads really nice and creates a beautiful color. Now I'm just gonna like really mix in that pigment from where I was drawing and wet the entire space. Doing this allows you to see if there's any leftover texture from the color pencil when you were drawing it down as well. Now let's just go over the house itself, just to put some water in there and see how strong the pigment of the colored pencil will spread on its own.
Now that I've done that, I want to actually now see how it performs if I were to draw onto a wet spot. Something else that's interesting about them is that you can wet the crayon itself and get paint that way. Sorry, I keep calling this a crayon, and I apologize for that. All right, now that we have this, let's let it set it aside and actually get to the watercolor crayons now that I keep saying that word, crayon. So this one here is from Caran D'Ache, their NeoColor 2. They are the only brand that I've ever experienced for watercolor crayons, truly, and I absolutely love them.
I'm going to do the same things as I did with the colored pencil. I'm going to draw on a thick area that I can then later go back and re-wet.
Let's do a house again.
And I'm going to attempt to draw a house again. Not sure what it is about having a camera watch me do this, but it felt really difficult. Now let's wet it down. You can really see just how strong that pigment is and how easily it re-wets with the water. And when I go over it with my paintbrush to really get to that area where I thickly drew it down, it feels really smooth as I do it. And for this section, because it's such a strong flow of a pigment, the house is a lot more filled out than it was with the colored pencil.
Okay, let's draw onto that wet space. And I'm gonna just wet this end.
Something to keep in mind though is also that the colored pencil has a thicker drawing space, so you get more of the pigment on the paper.
The last one I want to swatch is a pre-made pan. So I'm going to swatch one of these Roman Szmal watercolor paints. You purchase them from the store as a pan. And normally what I would do is take my water spritzer, quickly wet it for about a couple of seconds, grab my paintbrush, and grab my paint. Now, not all paints that dry in a pan re-wet the same. Some of the pigments are a little harder, so they take a little bit longer to reactivate, and some of them dry a little cakey. You'll find that it just comes down to the manufacturer, the supplies and materials that they're made with, as well as the pigments themselves. Alrighty, so while these are all drying, let's get to experimenting and seeing how these different paints interact with one another. For this next stage, I'm going to be using my sketchbook to really just experiment with it. When it comes to exploring paints and things like that, I always recommend actually having a book that you can keep on hand and reference back to. I have two of them. This is something that I've had for a lot of years. I'm almost finished the book, but in here I just map out my palettes or colors that I'm mixing for paintings. This one here I use primarily for my acrylic paints and every once in a while my watercolors. And this one here is for all of my watercolor based products. So I will swatch out some colors, test them out and mix them and see what's going on and how they interact with one another. It's also a great place where you can keep some of the wrappings from different manufacturers that you have, because the packaging themselves might contain some information you might want to reference back to in the future, like pigment information, if it's light fast, opaque, or transparent, anything like that. So let's find a blank page and start experimenting. I think I'm going to start off by taking some of my Roman Szmal's Ultramarine Blue. This is a beautiful, granulating, bright, vibrant blue color that I absolutely love. And I'm just going to take some of my liquid and drop it in. So cool. And now I'm going to just take that liquid and scratch around. I think I'm going to take now a Prussian blue. So it's a little bit of a darker blue. Just kind of interact like that. Gonna grab some water. Just put it on the edges and see what happens. I'm gonna take my what color is this one called? Pink Beige from the Ecoline brand. Move it around a little on the page. Grab that ultramarine again. Just kind of dab it in here. Ooh, almost gonna do this, the Prussian blue as well. Do that again. This time, instead of using paint per se, I'm gonna grab a green colored pencil. Now I'm calling this a colored pencil versus a colored crayon. Hoo-wee, Leah. Gotta love how my brain's working today. Grabbing a marker. Okay, the last thing I'm going to draw out before everything can dry is the colored watercolor pencil. I'm gonna set this aside as well, and with the magic of TV kind of thing, I'm gonna be back as soon as everything is dried, and we're gonna do a little bit more playing once it's dried. Let's take a look at our dried swatch cards. First up, the traditional styled, fresh from a tube and fresh from a pan. They are your classic looking watercolor paints and so great to have for referencing. And then we did the liquid, and this here has such an interesting dry pattern when we did the drop into water, and it creates such unique ways to it. So if you're looking to be more abstract with your approach to watercolors and just letting it do its own thing, doing some drops into water, so different. Up next, let's take a look at the markers. As you can see, the Ecoline light pink didn't really water down that much when it was activated with the paint. However, it did really well when putting on to wet. Whereas the Faber-Castell one actually did create an interesting effect, and it wasn't too strong for the drawing onto. And the last ones we're gonna look at and compare are gonna be the drawing for the crayon and pencil. When doing a more concentrated drawing area, I would say that the Caran D'Ache Crayon is a smoother transition versus the watercolor pencil. However, when it comes to things like this, you also want to keep in mind that different brands have different characteristics and different capabilities. When you compare mine to, say, yours, it might look a little differently. Next, let's take a look at our dried experiment with our mixing everything together. Okay, almost everything is dry. There's just still a little bit of a wet spot here because I put in some thick water at this point. And this little blob right here. Let's actually use some paper towel and soak that up a little because that was a big wet spot and it was going to take a really long time to dry. So when we examine this, we can just see how different paint blended in with one another. For here, a deep ochre from the Ecoline was very overpowering, even though we were using it with a very strong blue. So you can see it's a very deep blue here, but it becomes overpowered by the Ecoline to create some very interesting interactions. And before we conclude today's experiment with just playing with our watercolors, I want to take this a little bit further, and now that it's kind of dried and things are laid down, I'm going to take a wet paintbrush and just go over some of this area. So this part was where I drew on top of the watercolor crayon with a watercolor marker. So I want to just see if I can reactivate this area and get a mixture of color. And then I'll just bring some water here and see what happens to those edges. I'm also going to go over to this very interesting area here. Let's just split this up. And you can see how the smooth, let's try that sentence again, guys. How the very smooth dye-based ink for the Ecoline created some very interesting textures while working with the granulating color of the ultramarine. And now that that's there, I'm gonna try to see if I can activate this whole area and maybe spread it out a little more. What can happen? Interesting, right? So the Ecoline stayed in place, but because the ultramarine, I was able to create a different version of it with a mixture and kind of pull it down. I'm also gonna just, for the fun of it, take some of my pink. Just see what happens. I want you guys to really just explore what you have, play with what you're creating, and don't focus on creating an end result. Just focus on blending colors together, playing with different textures that you can get from the paint itself by mixing your different versions of watercolor supplies. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. And I hope you guys have a lot of fun with today's experiments, and look forward to tomorrow, where we're going to take a deep dive into the different types of shapes and capabilities of paintbrushes. Thank you again, and until next time, stay magical.